Good evening, everybody. Hey, Martin, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Well, all righty then. Good evening and welcome to
Wait
episode.
a minute.
What?
Wait a minute. Wait a minute.
Yes, sir.
Your next question should have been, are you ready?
Are you ready,
No.
Martin?
Give me a second. Um, no, I'm not.
Give me a thumbs up when you're ready.
Okay, go.
Good evening and welcome to episode 2 of Punchbowl Garden and Home. Just for continuity, I am going to go through all those whipty-dipty introductions again, just for any new people that enter the room. So tonight I am once again joined by Mr. Martin Gale, or as I like to call him, the singing RN from the Magnolia State. Martin is a fellow core member of the Punchbowl team and often serves as a host, co-host, and speaker in both Punchbowl spaces and his own independent pop-up spaces. And I am your host, Kevin M. Nelson. You may know me as an occasional co host or the daily PSA guy for the Punch Bowl, encouraging you to like and retweet the Punch Bowl Town Square space. That space runs every morning from about 7:30 a.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern. And while I'm on the issue of spaces, what you may not know is you can now go to www.thepunchbowlspace.com and you can see a list of all of our scheduled spaces. What you may not know is that I have spent 31 of the last 33 years in horticulture with almost 20 years in growing and propagation. A year as a gardening foreman for a high end landscaping company, and now 11 years in sales. I graduated from an agricultural high school in Massachusetts in 1994 as a plant science horticulture major and got my degree in commercial floriculture from the Stockbridge School of Agriculture at UMass Amherst in 1996. I've spent most of the past 3 decades professionally in the realm of potted ornamental plants, annuals, perennials, bulbs, and indoor ornamentals like succulents and houseplants, while at home spending time working in my vegetable gardens, containers, and flower beds, and occasionally I do water my houseplants before they die. Each episode will run about an hour or two, like last time, during which I will share my knowledge and experience on each topic, mostly in a presentation format. But I will also open it up to you to share your experiences, ideas, or to ask questions a little later in the show. For the sake of time and overall flow, I simply ask you try to keep your comments and questions as succinct and focused as possible so we can get others in on the conversation. My goal is to make Punchbowl Garden Home one of the most informative and entertaining spaces on Twitter in the weeks to come. Tonight, I've asked Martin to help me run a tight ship. Nothing in the nest without approval, no locked or questionable accounts as speakers, and he will not be entertaining any breaking news unless someone or something is in imminent danger. We are all aware of the sad news out of Tennessee, and we are going to try to make our lives beautiful in this ugly world by spending some time talking about plants and flowers and take a little break from the ugliness. And with that, a little bit more housekeeping to cover my butt. The information presented on the Punchbowl Garden and Home is for the purpose of entertainment and knowledge only. It is up to each individual in the listening audience to decide how best to safely and legally apply that knowledge. Be sure to check all federal, state, and local laws and ordinances and read all labeling before building, digging, planting, or applying any types of fertilizers or pesticides. Okay, are you ready? Let's turn those thumbs green. So, if you missed episode 1, we covered types of gardening and talked a bit about greenhouses, raised beds, growing in the ground, and my favorite, anybody remember? Containers! We touched on soils and soilless media, fertilizers and limestone, and talked a little bit about pH. I want to take a brief moment to tie up some loose ends from the past episode and then expound for just a bit on pH. Now, what I've done, just to avoid all of the trauma from episode 1, is I have a nice long thread up in the nest. I do have some pieces of that thread individually posted, but if you go to the first post in the nest and scroll over to that, you'll see a nice, pretty pansy flower. If you click on that, you will see the whole thread that actually covers episode 1 and will cover what we're talking about tonight in episode 2. So you can follow along. Try not to go too far ahead so you don't miss what we're actually talking about. That's a temptation sometimes when you have all the information in front of you. Skip ahead, find out how it ends. Well, we'll get there. First, when we were talking about perlite, I mentioned that there was a drawback to perlite, but I never clarified that statement. So that's the first thing I want to address this evening. The only real drawback that I am aware of is more so if you're buying perlite in bulk and you do your own mixing. The fine white dust from bulk perlite, if inhaled in higher concentrations over and over again, can cause a condition called white lung. It's similar to asbestosis. This is not something that I am personally concerned about when it comes to perlite being in your favorite growing mix. Just use caution anytime you are handling dry materials of any kind that produce an inhalation hazard. Uh, Even soil, uh, anything in a dry formulation, fertilizers, soils. You know, if you have a lot of stuff kicking back in your face, a little bandana over the mouth. I know after the past 3 years we've all been through with other things in this world. Nobody likes masks, but just use caution. Protect those lungs. Which leads me to limestone. During episode 1, Steve asked about the best time and way and amount of lime to add to the garden. My preferred method is still going to be going to mixing about half a cup of powdered lime with 5 gallons of water and applying that to the soil of my containers, rinsing off the foliage and lightly drenching the soil when I'm done. And that way you don't have to worry about the leaves getting burned. In a 7 to 10 gallon pot, I'd probably add about 2 cups of water per lime mixture. Uh, 2 cups of the water lime, sorry, rewind, add 2 cups of the water lime mixture. So you've mixed that half cup in the 5 gallon bucket. Add that to about in a 7 to 10 gallon pot, 2 cups of that, and then, rinse the foliage, as I mentioned, so you don't burn the leaves. Hit that soil with another 1 to 2 quarts of clear water. That'll help soak that in and get it into the root zone. One online source, Black Hawk Hardware, when I was doing a little more research, suggests that the rule of thumb is 40 pounds per 1,000 square feet to raise the pH, and no more than 50 pounds per 1,000 square feet in 1 year. So hopefully Steve will come back to the space, or he'll play the recording and hear that, because that was more so for Steve. One thing, and it's not in my notes, but I did want to mention it, is I was reading through all the great comments that people left after episode 1, things that you don't like to be planted together. There was one about tilling versus no tilling. Of course, I was on here saying that I prefer tilling, and I still do. It could be my New England upbringing. Every garden is going to be different, whether you're in New England, you're in the Carolinas, you're in Arizona, your soil is going to be different. I did look into that article, and I did see they produced some nice heads of lettuce without tilling. Around here, I just cannot fathom doing that, because the ground is like concrete in the spring until you get the tools in there and get it worked up and get a nice fluffy texture going. That's going to allow air and air movement and gases to flow. So I still prefer tilling, but with anything, try it out. if you've been tilling your garden and it's, you're having so-so results or poor results, try not tilling. Let me not be an obstacle in your way on that. I prefer tilling and really getting the ground mixed up. But what works for me might not work for you. So uh, try. And the other thing I would say, common phrase, if it's not broke, don't fix it. If you're having good results with whatever you're doing, um, don't be quick to try something new uh, in a large scale. So as we go along each week and we talk about stuff, you're like, oh, well, I don't do that. Well, if you're having good results, maybe you'll have better results if you try something that we talk about. But don't try to do it on a big scale if you're already having decent results doing what you're doing. So, you know, when it comes to adding the lime to raise that pH, it's all going to depend on the desired pH, the current pH, and the makeup of your soil. And your water alkalinity is also a factor. Uh, we will get to the, what alkalinity means versus the pH very soon. But if you have high alkalinity water, that basically means it's harder to acidify anything. So if you have high alkalinity water and you're trying to lower the pH, that's going to be difficult because you're going to end up neutralizing a lot of that acidifying fertilizer when you apply it. Last week, Amy, Question It, asked about pH test kits and probes. Uh, I looked online, and pH test kits for soil are readily available for homeowners, ranging from about $8 to $30 and up. Though I haven't got hung up on testing my pH in the past, my birthday is next week, and my wife was looking for ideas. So we'll see if I get one. If I do, I guess I'll have to be more proactive on testing my soil. And then I can speak a little bit more directly on some of these pH issues. At this time, I do want to take a quick run through on pH before we dig too deeply in our other topics tonight. There's many variables involved. What you're growing, again, the alkalinity of your water, what type of fertilizer you use. I don't want to get too bogged down on this topic and end up making too many generalizations that may not necessarily apply to the entire audience. And I want to get to garden layout planning and hopefully ground cover plants before we wrap up. So just some pH basics. The pH scale runs from 0 to 14. And you can actually find this again if you click on the nest. You can find the thread. There's a nice little picture there that shows you the scale, and I've even got it highlighted, the happy place for veggies. But that scale runs from 0 to 14, and a pH of 7 is considered neutral. If the pH is lower than 7, it's considered acidic, and if the pH is higher than 7, it's considered alkaline. However, sources that listed alkaline-loving plants, the pH range for those plants had a starting point below 7. Example, spinach, considered a vegetable for alkaline soil, and the pH range given was 6.0 to 7.5. Well, 6.0 is a whole point below neutral, making it acidic, right? So, like much of the information compiled about pH, it can be confusing. So, what is pH? pH is the measure of hydrogen and hydroxyl ions, acid ions, versus alkalinity, which is the measure of carbonate or bicarbonate, like dissolved limestone, in water. High alkalinity, as I said before, makes it harder to acidify. And what does this mean in practical terms? It essentially means that if you have a high pH in your soil, and then you try using something like aluminum sulfate to acidify your soil, like if you're trying to turn those hydrangeas blue, but you have a high alkalinity in your water, it's going to require a higher dose to get that pH lower. In general, another generalization here, sandy soils need less material to raise or lower the pH, and clay soils are going to need more material to raise or lower the pH. I did talk to some professional, say that, professional growers at work, and I checked multiple sources, and here is what I came up with. If your vegetable garden is maintaining a pH of 5.8 to 6.2 or as high as 6.5, you should be okay. For most vegetables, that is, without worrying about specific, pH of different plants. So, long story short on that, if you want to separate and have different beds for different plants and really narrow down the pH for specific plants, that's not a bad idea at all. One of the things you'll see in the nest is some common vegetables and the pH ranges they prefer, and you can see that there's some differences there. So that is not entirely, a bad idea to segregate your vegetables and do something like that. But most people don't want to do that. They just want to have a nice plot and plant everything and just go into the garden and pick. So that's when that kind of generalized range of the 5.8 to 6.2 is more beneficial, because you kind of have a range there. So whether it's cucumbers or zucchini or tomatoes, if you're somewhere in that range, you're probably not going to hurt anything too badly. You may want to start out with a pH of 7 or 7.5, though, if the fertilizer or other materials that you're applying have an acidifying nature. You'll see, and it's kind of weird how Twitter does it. I posted it as a comment to one of the tweets in the thread. So you may have to click on the line under that pH scale to open up the comments. Otherwise, I think it shows up all the way down at the bottom. But you'll see a photo of some very large bales of peat moss that we use professionally in the greenhouse. And I'm not looking at the picture at this moment, but I believe it was something like 5.4/6.3, something in that range. So that tells you that peat moss there is starting off fairly acidic. So it wouldn't be, and I know when they mix that up with, fertilizers and perlite and other things, they do add lime to correct that. But it's not a bad idea to check the pH of the soil you're starting out with, whether it's a bagged mix or even if you're digging up, your field soil after the winter and you haven't planted anything yet. Check that. If that pH is low, go ahead and apply some lime to get the pH up. Because again, as you go back and you go applying fertilizers to it, you're going to slowly chip away at that pH. Unless the alkalinity is fairly stable and the fertilizer itself is not very acidifying, then it may drop even slower. So just a few more tidbits on pH, and then we can keep going. Alkalinity of I apologize. So we're going to go to alkalinity, which is different from pH. As I mentioned, alkalinity more speaks to your water. Alkalinity of 30 to 400 parts per million and a pH of 7.2 to 7.6 is considered okay for drinking water. So if that's what's coming out of your hose, if you have town water, municipal water, you're starting with a fairly high pH. It would be good to test that water, test the soil, and then apply water to your soil and see how the alkalinity reacts, and see, are you really raising the pH of that whatever media you're using, the peat moss, or is it staying pretty stable? If it's staying pretty stable, but it's still too low or too high, that's when you're going to want to take other actions like applying limestone to get it up or using an acidifying fertilizer to drop that pH down. So one of the photos you'll see in that thread, it says, I found a long list of plants and the ideal pH ranges at, I think this actually goes to the Old Farmer's Almanac, but it's www.almanac.com-pH. And that link is actually on the thread. Again, you may be able to open that up under that pH scale, or it'll show up at the bottom of the thread, but you'll see some pink and blue hydrangeas and the title to that link. That, if you go to that and scroll down, you'll find blueberries on there, all different kinds of vegetables, shrubs. So that turned out to be a very good find in trying to gather information about various pHs. Just a few as an example: peppers and tomatoes, 5.5 to 7.5, optimal. That's the okay range. The optimal is 6.2 to 6.8. Cucumbers, 6.0 to 6.5. Zucchini, 6.0 to 7.5 is optimal. But according to this, as high as 8 is okay. So zucchini will take it pretty alkaline. And for the acid-loving plants like hydrangeas, 4.5 to 5.5 for blue and 6.0 to 6.2 for pink. And if you have a blue hydrangea, that doesn't mean that, like Nico Blue is one example of a perennial hydrangea that flowers on old wood. It's an old-fashioned variety. And that's why if you hack your plant back too much, you're going to be sending me DMs. Hey, why isn't my hydrangea flowering this year? That won't necessarily turn bright pink if you lower your pH. However, if your pH is too low or there's not enough aluminum present, then you might get more of a purple color. Whereas if your pH is higher and you have enough aluminum in the soil that it can uptake, and you're not applying, I think I mentioned this in the previous episode, but remember, if you're trying to acidify, especially hydrangeas with aluminum sulfate, do not apply a blossom boosting fertilizer with that high middle number. That phosphorus is going to bind with the aluminum. That's going to settle out, and your plant is not going to be able to take that up. And just one more little thing of note on hydrangeas, because they're so popular. If that pH goes up too high and it's greater than 6.4, you could end up with iron deficiency. So then you're actually going to start seeing, issues with the foliage versus, if the pH is just a little bit off, maybe your flower is not the color you want it, gets up too high, now the plant itself, you're going to see chlorosis. And chlorosis is just a fancy word for when you see yellowing. If it's in between the veins, it's interveinal chlorosis. And then there's other types that are more of a irregular pattern. Sometimes you'll get an issue from a deficiency or a toxicity from nutrients where the chlorosis will be veinal. And so you'll have bright yellow veins and the tissue in between the veins will be green. So before we go full bore into the other topics this evening, does anyone have any questions or comments? I'm going to take a sip of coffee. I think I may have put some of you to sleep. Sometimes conversations on pH can be that way. That's why I didn't want to get bogged down on it too much tonight. So our next topic is garden layout plans. The following contains excerpts from something I wrote in 2016. Things to consider when you're building a vegetable garden. And I'm gonna I'm gonna preface this by saying I do things a little different now because I do everything in containers. So what this was a few years ago, I wrote this. I had a gardening page on Facebook, and it's actually still there. So if you go to that other site, it's the Nelson Gardens. Um, but what I was trying to do is come up with a kind of a roadmap of how you could set up a garden and have things set up appropriately for the way the sun rises and sets and things aren't getting shadowed and overcrowded. I don't do things quite the same way because I do everything in containers. So a lot of the photos you'll see of my gardens now, I might do squash in, in a large pen so that they can spread out, and then I'll do shorter tomato plants around the exterior. Or in another garden, you'll see a photo where I have, I started with some broccoli plants. Shout out to Webmeister. Some broccoli plants on the edges because those get a little bit taller, but that midday sun was hitting the center, so I put some corn and some squash and stuff in the center there. And with that, before I go any further, I'm going to go to Mr. Webmeister. Go ahead.
Oh, I was on mute. Damn it. My wife was looking it up. Is it the Facebook group Nelson Gardens?
It's actually a page, the Nelson Gardens, and you should. I don't have it pulled up, but I think in the cover photo there's either some tomatoes or there's a granite slab painted blue with an N and three leaves around it that say the Nelson Gardens. But that's me. Um, you'll recognize some of the photos from episode 1 and episode 2, I think. So if you find that one, it should be facebook.com/the Nelson Gardens. So going further on the garden layout plans, and I'm going to try to run through this quickly because I do things a little bit different, but you may have a garden carved out and you want to try to put stuff in a way where you have enough space for things. So I'll just run through this and we'll see where it takes us. So things to consider when you're building a vegetable garden. Do you have an area that gets 6 or more hours of afternoon sunlight? That's going to be key because trust me, especially when we moved here and there were all these pine trees around, I looked and researched and asked, is there anything I can grow in the shade for vegetables? And some will be a little tolerant of shade, but for the most part, most of the vegetables you want to grow, they want to be in full sun. So having at least 6 hours of afternoon sunlight is going to be critical. If it's even longer, if you got a big wide open space and there's no large trees around, even better. Uh, it's really sunlight and water and occasionally fertilizer, and that's where the magic happens. How large or small do you want your garden to be? That's something you kind of need to plan out ahead of time. In my case, I probably should have discussed that with my wife a little bit more before I took over the whole backyard, but she has since forgiven me. What types of vegetables do you like? That's another thing. Sit down, as you map out how you're going to do this garden, square or rectangle, start making a list. What do you actually want to grow? What does your family eat? If your family doesn't like carrots and you're not in a situation where you're going to barter carrots with your neighbor, don't waste your time on carrots. Simple as that. Make a list of all those things that, I mean, it also depends, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but the heck with it. It may depend on when you want to eat these vegetables too. Because some people, they're very simple. I want to plant some lettuce and tomatoes and some cucumbers, and I want to eat salad all summer. And then after that, I don't care till next spring. Fine. Plan your garden accordingly. Then there's some people like myself that want to do all that, but I also want to have something to carry into the winter. So spaghetti squash, butternut squash, acorn squash, um, extra tomatoes so that those can be, boiled down and canned for salsa and pasta sauce. So that's one thing to consider. So if I skim over that again when I get to it on my write up here, we'll go real fast. Uh, Gardens can range from a small container with a few plants in it to unlimited acreage of mounds and rows, depending upon your unique experience. The type of vegetables you choose will determine when and how often you harvest. Radishes only take about a month, while butternut squash, melons, or pumpkins can take anywhere from 2.5 to 4 months to grow. So if you love radishes, great. You can harvest those every month. But you're going to be spending 3 to 4 months taking care of a butternut squash plant before you see the fruits of your labor. So, another thing to consider. The first thing that should be done is removal of all grass and weeds from the soil surface. I strongly advise against chemical herbicides of any kind. They can persist. If you want to spray something that kills weeds, look into recipes for natural ways like vinegars, soaps, and salts. There's actually recipes online that, you can mix some fairly benign household things and it will burn the weeds, and you don't have to worry about have you or someone been injured by coming up down the road. So I just throw that out there because we're learning more and more about all of these wonderful chemicals that we thought had a place in the world and seemed to do something necessary, but it turns out that was not the healthiest thing for us. So make your own choices, of course, but I advise trying to go a natural route and knock those down. I think you're better off using, garden hose and iron rakes to remove all the plant material from the site. Actually get in there, loosen that stuff up. If you have a tiller like Steve, I think, said he had, and you can get in there and plow it all under, great. That's added organic material for that garden. Otherwise, if you're doing this by hand, use a garden hoe, or I mentioned in episode 1, there's a thing called a hula hoe that kind of looks like the stirrup on a saddle, and you use that to scrape up those plants, and it just pretty much cuts them off right at the root. And I would get those out of there before you even start digging, because if you're going to dig by hand, especially, you got to make sure you dig every clump and flip it over, and you don't have weeds sticking out, peeking their ugly heads out, causing trouble later. So I would invest the time. Some people don't want to, go quite that far. Great. You can probably rent a rototiller from Home Depot and do it quick. So yeah, remove any of the tough roots. If you're going to use an area that is currently covered with grass, skim the top a few inches, flip over the clumps. That'll allow the grass roots to dry and some of that soil to dry. Then you can just go and just pick up those clumps, shake it off. That way you're not digging up, the top couple of inches of your garden and losing all of that. Although what you can do is, if you want to just kind of scrape that all out and not worry about the soil that's left behind on the roots, put that in a compost pile, keep churning that, and then you can end up, once that breaks down, you can end up transporting that back to your garden. With the area cleared, the next step is to aerate that soil as much as possible. Again, I like tilling, so whether it's manually or with a rototiller, make a nice fluffy environment for those young roots to grow and thrive. You can use shovels and forks, or like I said, a rototiller to break up any hard ground and create a soft bed of soil as deep as possible. Air is very important. You don't want too many pockets of air in there when you're done. Um, you don't want little tiny caves in your garden where roots will start to grow in and they'll dry out. But you want some porousness. You want some fluffy texture, some air, because all those, CO2 and O2 and, all those fertilizers reacting, anytime gases can just flow freely through the soil, that's going to be a healthier soil than anything that's compact and suffocating. Then you're going to get, anaerobic conditions without oxygen, if you don't remember that from science class. As you do this, you'll likely find plenty of rocks. Those rocks can be harvested during preparation, and they're great to use as a garden border or between the rows where you walk in your garden. I don't, again, where I'm using containers, I'm not digging up as much, but that was something I did in the old garden, which if Webmeister's checking out that other page, he might see the old garden where there was some more soil being dug up. Anytime I found rocks, I just scooped those up, and those went around the garden at the base of the fence. And that way, if any woodchucks or anything tried digging under it, they had more to fight with. At this point, you're ready to help your garden take shape. Where you put the mounds and rows or place your containers will depend on what you're growing. Planting should be done after the danger of a hard frost is past. In New England, it's usually following the full moon in May. I don't know why. It just is. Your conditions could be totally different depending upon where you are in the United States. I mean, you might already have tomatoes planted. I don't know. I can only speak to New England, and then you adjust it how it's going to fit you. If the long-term forecast prior to that does not indicate that any temperatures are expected below 35 or 40, you should be okay to start planting. Cabbages, lettuce, spinach, broccoli, they'll all survive some temperatures in the high 30s. Peas and beans will do okay in the 40s, and most everything else will do best when the nights are at least in the 50s and the days are in the 60s or 70s. Frost is the big red flag, though. Plant after the last, possible frost, and cover plants or run a mist sprinkler at night if you hear there's a sudden call for frost. Again, you might be somewhere where that's not an issue, and I am jealous if that is the case. In New England, every day counts, so waiting until June to plant the garden is fine, but you may cut into your harvest. I know a lot of people around here, they'll wait till May 15th, May 30th. I moved from zone 6A to zone 5A, a full zone north. And people around here, some were saying, oh, wait till June 1st, wait till June 10th. Ain't no way I'm waiting that long. Most of your tomatoes and, stronger plants, I guess, would be the best term. A tomato has some beefiness to it. It's not as soft as, like a squash plant. Those will take a light frost. It's not going to be happy, but I've done it. So, use your discretion where you are. If you think you're in the clear, go ahead, start working it, get the plants in there. If you hear all of a sudden, oh crap, we're going to be down to 31 tonight, then again, try to cover stuff. I recommend using cloth of some sort if you're going to cut, old sheets. If you have any of those laying around, burlap bags, something cloth and porous. Only because if the temperature gets down too far and you use plastic, a lot of times under that plastic you'll get condensation before it freezes, and then you'll have leaves that actually freeze to the plastic, and you go to pull that plastic off in the morning because you want the sun to hit it and everything to warm up, and you'll end up tearing off leaves because it got frozen to the plastic. So anytime you can use something of a cloth nature when you're trying to protect for frost, I would advise that. Keep in mind that the tallest items should be on the east or the south side of the garden, as not to block the afternoon sun from hitting the shorter plants. Okay, now close your eyes if you will. You don't have to. I won't tell. But imagine a garden layout where the width runs left to right, and that's east to west. Here are some ideas of what you could plant, making the most of that layout. Start with snow peas planted in close proximity to the fence on the east side. They will slowly start to grow up that fence. And a little note on snow peas, they've made them better. You can actually find varieties that say stringless. Those are the best ones if you don't like chewing on green hair when you get those snow pea pods. So a lot easier to prep those snow peas, the ones that say stringless. I think the variety I did last year, and I just did a small batch. I believe they were called Sugar Daddy, and they were stringless. So you could just pick them off young. They're great fresh. Dip them in things, eat them the way they are, put them in stir fries. I got all excited about snow peas, but we'll keep going on this imaginary garden. So we're going left to right, east to west. We've got snow peas planted near the fence. And then to the right of that, you could do a row or multiple rows of green beans. Those will grow immediately to the west or to the right. Carrots and radishes can be planted in the area in front. So there'd be the north-facing side as you're looking at your imaginary garden. Do those in the front due to their low height. That way, when you come up on your garden, you also have a view of everything. Things aren't hidden, things aren't getting weeds, and it's getting away from you because you're, out of sight, out of mind. Those also, carrots and radishes, those will also need to be thinned out to get the best results. So keeping them in the front where you can keep an eye on them and have easier access to them versus them getting lost kind of in the back of the garden or off to the side, that'll be good. Plus, when this all unfolds, everything's gonna, as the sun rises in the east and then sets in the west, the shorter material is not going to be overshadowed by the taller items. Or at least if we're doing it right, hopefully that's what happens. I mentioned previously, but I have it here again. So I'll mention it again for those that love radishes. You can yield as many as 3 to 5 crops of radishes, harvesting every 30 to 40 days from seed. So keep those in front, again, for easy accessibility. So we're moving a little further west in this imaginary garden layout. The entire west side of the garden can be turned into large mounds for cucumbers and zucchini, and those will grow without hindering the rest of the garden. The zucchini will grow early. I've seen zucchini in 2 different forms. I always get, like Black Beauty or Elite Gray. It's more of a bush type zucchini. I think the old fashioned ones were more of a vine, but I prefer I prefer the bush types. They'll grow like an upright bush, and the leaves can get pretty large, whereas the cucumbers will trail like vines. The cucumbers can be allowed to grow up the west side fence or simply creep around the ground, around the zucchini and eastward down that side of the mound. The zucchini could actually be positioned in the middle, allowing plenty of space for the cucumbers to thrive on either side. Um, I'm going to take a quick break from this, even though it's almost done, and just mention that since I've gone to containers, what I do in the back of the garden is use some very large pots and plant the cucumbers in that, and then put large, around here they're called plow stakes because we get so much snow. They put the stakes out so that people can see where the edges are, and people's prize hydrangeas don't disappear in the winter when they plow. But you can just get wooden plow stakes. You can get fiberglass ones. I just like to get the 1 inch square, 5 to 6 foot tall plow stakes. I'll put those in, and then I'll take twine and go back and forth, almost creating like a spider web above the cucumbers. And cucumbers will grow, I want to say, by the time I was done last season, they had kept growing up and up. I actually had to find some large maple branches that were skinny enough from some tree work I did in the backyard. I want to say they were like 8 or 9 feet off the ground. Cucumbers love to be picked often. So as soon as they're up to size that works for you, keep picking those. That will encourage the cucumbers to keep coming. And the more they can just keep growing and spreading out, you're going to get new flowers on those and continue to get cucumbers. Okay, I interrupted myself. Back to the layout. Tomatoes or corn can line the southern fence in the back of the garden. Mature tomatoes can be planted outside the fence directly or in large pots on the east or south sides to capture even more space outside the confines of the fencing. So again, picture this. So on your left side, you got your snow peas growing up the fence. And then to the right of that, you've got your beans. Then you've got some cucumber mounds. You've got zucchinis and more cucumbers, with those growing up the western side of the fence. And then in the back, so the farthest part of your garden from where you're standing, you've got the corn or tomatoes or both. And then you can start tomatoes in pots, and you could actually put those outside the east side of the fence. I would put them in such a way that they don't totally block out all the morning sun from those snow peas. But as I mentioned in episode 1, your things like rabbits and woodchucks, those tend to go after, at least when it comes to tomatoes, they tend to go after them when they're smaller and tender. If they have other grass and weeds and other things to nibble on, they're not likely going to come over to a tomato plant after it's 1 to 2 feet tall and mow it down. I mean, a woodchuck might do that just to be a jerk because that's how woodchucks are. But, in general, most of your little critters around are not going to go. I don't know whether they don't like the taste when they get older or it's just too much work. But anytime you can keep your tomatoes secure, because you'll see in other photos that I post as we go along, you'll see I've got tomato plants around the grill. I've got 7-foot tall ones in the backyard, just out there. And I'm over here practically in Canada, like Jeff. Just kidding. No, I'm near New Hampshire, so we have deers that go through, and I've got woodchucks, and rabbits and squirrels and everything else you can imagine. Um, and I didn't have a problem with the tomatoes. So, all that to say, if you do have a tendency to have issues with animals like that, I would start the tomatoes. Um, if you well, that's assuming you even want tomatoes. If you want more tomatoes than what's growing inside the fenced in area, start them in pots, pot to pot, and when they get a little bit of height on them, they can go outside the garden anywhere that you have space to put them. Uh, the things I would keep, and again, this isn't in these notes, but that's how my brain works, so bear with me. The things that you want to keep, even if you do things in containers, the things you want to keep in fenced in areas that are more appealing, more tempting for rabbits and woodchucks are things like cabbages, broccoli, uh, squash plants. Um, After squash get to a certain age, I find that things like woodchucks and squirrels will go after the fruit when the fruit starts to set. Like on a spaghetti squash, they'll start to nibble on the mature fruit. The plants themselves, once they get to a certain size, aren't as tasty. But when it comes to things like lettuces and cabbages and broccolis and kales, whatever it is about that stuff, they will mow that down in one night. I remember in the old garden at the old house, I had this little red cabbage that I was nurturing along, and the thing was like bigger than a softball, which at the time was, impressive to me. And the area was fenced in, but it was the old fashioned metal fencing that was like 2 inches by 4 inches. They were little rectangles. Now, that keeps most things out. But if you've ever seen a baby rabbit, they're mostly fur. They can fit through the tiniest spaces. I've actually watched them jump without touching. It's like that game Operation you play as a kid and you got to pick up the thing without touching the sides. I watched these baby rabbits jump through that 2 by 4 inch spacing on the fence and without even touching it. It's just like they flew through. It was like out of the Matrix or something. But in one night, it just went in there and it mowed it, ate like half of it down. And then that was it. It wasn't interested in coming back and eating it because that's how these varmints, that's how they are. They'll take a little bite out of a cucumber, just enough so that you say, crap, I can't eat that one now. But they'll waste it. If they were my kids, they'd be punished. So we're almost done with the garden layout. So just a few ideas. So yeah, we already covered that. That was about the tomatoes, growing those in the fenced area if you have serious animal issues, and then putting them out. We touched on that. A few ideas on how to maximize the garden. You may choose to grow nothing but tomatoes. Even still, the same logic applies. Plant the tallest varieties, because even your tomatoes will range from ones that get 3 to 4 feet tall to ones that will grow as high as 12 feet. One of these nights we will talk about determinate and indeterminate tomatoes. Grow both. So the same logic applies even if you just had nothing but tomatoes. Plant your shortest varieties on the west side and the tallest varieties on the east or the south side, so that as that sun's going over, the shortest material is not being overshadowed. For my small winter squash garden last year, I planted shorter tomatoes in 2-gallon pots and lined all 4 sides of the fence. I mentioned that a little while ago. I think there's actually a photo in the thread. Again, if you joined us late, there is a thread that covers both episode 1 and episode 2 up in the nest. If you go to the original first post up in the nest with the pretty pansy flowers. Click on that. You can follow all the way down to all the topics we're discovering. But you'll see in that thread that squash garden I'm talking about, where I have those spaced out. I think they're on a blue tarp, and there's tomato plants all around the fence. The way the sun goes over my yard, those tomato plants weren't excessively tall, so those squash plants still got plenty of light. It's not in my notes per se, but since I pointed out those tomatoes around that squash, that's another tool in your tool chest. If you don't want plants to grow too big, you can control that with the size of the pot. So when I plant my tomatoes in, this big, massive pot that's like 3 feet across and 2 feet deep, that tomato, especially if it's an indeterminate tomato, that tomato can grow 8, 9, 10, 12 feet tall. However, around that squash garden, I specifically put those in 2-gallon pots. And what that did was, even though I got tomatoes off of every one of those plants, it's almost like bonsaiing. It stunted those tomatoes to the point where those only grew to 30, 36 inches, just pretty much to the top of the fence around those squash. And a lot of that just has to do with the size of the pot. It wasn't in a real big pot, so it just, kind of got to a certain point. Part of it is variety. So if you want to have short tomatoes and tall tomatoes, that's another thing to look into. The variety, what's going to be the mature height when it's done, and the ones that tend to grow a little taller and will grow and produce fruit until frost, those your indeterminate tomatoes, those you want to plant in such a way that they're not overshadowing those shorter tomatoes. So that was the garden layout. Questions, comments, experiences? I'm going to open it up. I'm going to take another sip of that coffee. Go for it.
Can I ask a question about, I didn't raise my hand. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask if I can do a quick question on the ground cover, or if you want me to wait.
You could ask the question. We are doing that next, but your question might actually help my brain formulate how we do that next segment. So go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, and thank you for getting the information about the pH kits. As far as ground cover, I am looking for ground cover, the best ground cover to have on a retaining wall, to have it kind of waterfall over the edge, if you will. So I didn't know if there were certain land covers that were better to use for that than other ground covers.
That is a great question, but I have to ask you a question. Question it. What type of sun exposure?
Almost sun all day.
Okay. So one option would be ivy. Ivy will take sun or shade, and that will overflow. When I looked into phlox subulata, creeping phlox, I saw the recommendations said part sun to shade, but anytime I've seen gorgeous creeping phlox, they've been in the sun. So I would not hesitate to go that route. You can get those in pink, purple, white. So it's emerald blue is one variety. Drummond's pink, Fort Hill. So Phlox would be a great one for color. Another thing you could look into is cotoneaster. It's like cotton Easter with one T. And cotoneaster is a shrub with little tiny leaves. It'll actually get berries. It might even get a little white flower before it gets the berries, but I don't think it's real showy. But that's also another nice look. There's actually a stone wall at work that's got that growing over the side. So I will take a photo of that and I will send that to you and maybe incorporate, just a quick shot of that in the next space. I'm just kind of looking down my list here. Another one would be Veronica Georgia Blue. It's got a fairly short flowering season, but nice bright blue flowers. That'll take full sun, zone 3 to 9. So unless you're in Miami, you're probably still plenty north. That zone 9's okay. Zone 3 is even north of me. So it's got a wide range of hardiness. It does flower usually for a couple of weeks, anywhere from like now to, late April, early May. All depends on the winter and how things warm up. Fragaria, which is actually wild strawberry. They've actually have some improved varieties now that come in hot pink and bright red. So that's certainly an option. There's one called bugleweed, ajuga. That, depending upon the variety, zone 3 to 9 or 4 to 11, that'll take sun or shade, and that'll actually give you some little spikes of blue flowers, but it will creep. So my recommendation out of all this, if you want to go with something in a perennial that's flowering, that's creeping, that's going to cascade, my two top choices for cascading over a wall would be the Phlox subulata or the Veronica Georgia Blue. And I can get you the species on that because I have a separate printout just for this occasion. And Veronica Georgia Blue, it also goes by Turkish Speedwell, and it's Veronica Liwanensis, Liwanensis, Liwanensis. So those would be my top two recommendations for a stone wall with sun.
Jen has a question. Go ahead, Jen.
Really quick, please do not plant ivy or ajuga if you ever plan on planting anything there again. They're both very invasive and hard to get back out of the soil. It's just something to consider anytime you're looking to plant ground cover. Make sure that it's something that if you change your mind and you want to plant something there in the future that you're able to. I love sedum, and there's a million different kinds. They turn almost neon fluorescent colors in the fall. They have beautiful flowers in the springtime. I have a southern facing front wall. I have a little rock berm that I did, and you can't even see my rocks now. They have covered everything. They cascade, and there's so many different varieties to get. In fact, you can just start a little bit in a seed patch, and after a few years, they just start spreading out and spreading out and spreading out. So, and also, if you wanted to do a great annual that cascades that the bees love and wildlife will love, and you can actually eat the leaves of, they taste very peppery, is nasturtium. Very easy to seed and grow. What I wanted to mention was also you were talking about pH before. In most areas, in most counties, unless you've done something specific to your soil already, you can get the typical pH of your area, and the same thing for the water in your area. So you may already have that information available, unless for some reason you have a different soil than what's in your area. But they include that for most subdivisions. They include the pH for what the fill dirt was in most subdivisions if you live in urban areas like I do. So I didn't even bother with my pH. I just looked it up on the site that was for my area. And the same thing with the water. I could look up the pH of my water for my area too.
So just a couple of quick comments on that. Yes, thank you, Jen. Sedum is another good one. Most of your sedums will have kind of a succulent look to them. Some are evergreen. Some will kind of, most of the leaves will die back and then they'll regrow. It depends on the variety. Flowers range from white, pink, orange. So just a couple of varieties. There's one called Camstachet. Well, I'm just going to spell it for anybody that's interested. Camstacheticum variegatum. It's Kamschaticum. That's a good low growing one. There's if you're far enough south, there's some that have kind of a needle-like foliage to them. So it almost looks like a Douglas fir type needles to them, but those are usually less hardy than some of the other varieties. There's Angelina, which is Sedum rupestre, and Sedum reflexum blue spruce. There's a great variety on Sedum is Red Dragon. That will have a nice bright color to the foliage. If you decide that you want to have permanent ground cover, certainly the ivy and ajuga is still an option. But to Jen's point, I guess if you decide that and I spoke to somebody recently who in their neck of the woods, ivy actually is a hiding spot for copperheads. So if you are down in southern regions and that is a problem, you might not want to grow ivy. As far as pH of water and soil, I would expect that the town at any time could probably tell you what your tap water is supposed to be running. I am less confident with the way things run off and flow. And if you've done any sort of gardening up to this point with any sort of fertilizers or limes, I would be less confident in a number that they would give me. As Jen was saying, though, if you haven't done anything, you just moved in, it's a fairly new development, you may be able to get a number that's fairly close. But if you invest that $8 to $30 in one of those pH meters, which I'm hoping to get one for my birthday, if you have one, just go ahead and use that, might as well. And before we go back to Jen, what do you got, Webmeister? Did I lose everybody?
I'm wondering if Webmeister's talking while on mute again. Go ahead, Jen.
Oh, I thought you were going back to Jen. I heard Jen, not Webmeister. Sorry.
Okay. So since Jen went, I'm going to go to you if you're available, and then we'll go back to Jen.
Okay. First of all, you're killing me here. My wife's 2 cocktails in, and you said there was a plant called Monica what? It was a Monica something? And Veronica, and she said Monica Lewinsky, and I said that comes with a stain, and she goes, no, it blows. But I did have a legit question. So I want to do some herbs in a pot. You were talking, because this is on topic, you were talking about plant things you can put together and things you cannot. If we're doing like basil, parsley, cilantro, the basic herbs you're going to snip and use for dinner, Are there any I cannot put in a pot together?
Well, I'm sure somebody will tell me, yes, there is, don't do that. But nothing that you mentioned would bother me putting in a large window box, or like sometimes you can get a nice decorative bowl and actually do like, parsley towards the back and then have some, thyme or oregano or whatever cascading over the front. Um, Basil tends to get pretty big. Uh, coriander will get tall. Cilantro and parsley will tend. They don't. Parsley doesn't get real tall, but it gets bushy. So you got to make sure you get enough space for that. But if you got a big enough container, yeah, you could put in a basil, some oregano. That's what I did in a couple of small window boxes around the garden last year. Was one had a basil in it, and then had some oregano creeping over the edge. Some others had. I don't think I did cilantro because I can't stand cilantro. It's one of those things, you love it or hate it, and I hate it. My wife likes it, but I grew hair, everything else. I wasn't growing cilantro. Uh, so yeah, nothing that you mentioned, other than perhaps making sure the container is big enough that things don't overcrowd each other. Have the creeping, trailing varieties like the thyme and the oregano on the edge. Have the bushier stuff in the back of the container. Uh, yeah, you could do that. And again, somebody might say I'm wrong, but I've done it. So there.
No, that's cool. I was just going to put like 2 in each. So, and they're about 14 inches across at the top. So I think it sounds like I'm good.
Yeah. And one thing I want to mention, because, Jen brought up not planting ivy or ajuga because of how invasive they can be. And you brought up herbs. If you want a ground cover that will take over your entire property and you'll never have to mow again and you'll never be able to get rid of it, besides poison ivy, mint. That is one where if you put mint in anything other than a container, you're going to be in trouble. Now, I happen to like mint and I like the smell. So I'm trying to convince my wife to let me do the whole front lawn in mint. And I don't know how that's going to look in the winter when it kind of dies back. But peppermint is, or chocolate mint is actually a variety of peppermint that tastes more like Andy's candies and less like peppermint patties. I don't like peppermint patties. I like Andy's candies. Chocolate mint is one that will trail and send out stolons. Those are those little creepy stems under the ground, and it'll take over your lawn. Of course, I would never be able to grow anything else in the front again, but my lawn would smell great every time I mowed it. So be careful with the mint unless you really love it. And I think we'll go back to Jen and then over to Steve. Steve, you came up early in the space, so I hope you have time to go back and listen to the beginning because we talked about lime and tilling and pH again. But we'll go to Jen and then over to New York, Steve.
Really quick for the herbs, in my area, also for ground cover, I have both phlox and sedum, and I'm in zone 6. So they overwinter perfectly. I have not lost any of my sedum. In fact, I've given away sedum to people who pass by my yard and have enough time for me to dig it up and hand them a clump so they can start it in their yard. The flax, not so much. That's really picky, and it's harder to propagate. The herbs, just make sure you have a lot of drainage. Herbs like heat and to be thirsty a little bit. The biggest thing with herbs is people tend to give them soil that's actually too good, and they overwater them, especially basil. Basil hates that. So just be careful with the soil that you're putting in the planter, that it has enough either grit or sand or something mixed in there so it can drain out and get dried out a little bit. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Jen. And yes, basil hates being overwatered. It also loves it warm. So don't try to start that one too early. Go ahead, New York Steve.
Thanks, Kevin. Sorry I missed the beginning part. I will go back and listen. I was just going to reiterate the thing about mint. My God, that thing will take over anything. And if anyone thinks of planting mint anywhere other than the smallest container, completely separated from everything else on your property, you're in for a doozy, because I got a mint derivative weed that took over a large portion of my flower beds and my lawn. Luckily, it was not like a deep rooted thing where I could actually scrape it off, and it was literally on the top, like eighth of an inch of soil, so I could just scrape it off and get rid of it. But watch out for anything that has mint in its name.
Amen. Go ahead, Jen.
I was going to note, I have currently 3 different kinds of mint in my yard. I have the chocolate mint, which you love, and I over harvest it because I make mint tea. I use it in my cooking. I love it. I can't get enough of mint. And unfortunately, I gave away the last of my mint, so I have no mint until I go out and feel like everything's popping back up again. I also have apple mint, which grows a little bit taller, but it has an incredible smell and it is furry, so it can really take some heat too. But my gosh, the taste of that is it's sweet and it really does smell like apples. I have pineapple mint, which is variegated. It's white and a lighter green, and it smells fantastic. I'm going to be growing agastache, which is a member of the mint family. So I'm really excited about that because it's a huge plant for pollinators. And again, because it's in the mint family, it's edible. So I'll be able to make teas out of that. I got rose mint, something daiquiri, and something else that I'm going to be getting. And another one, if people like licorice, hyssop, Korean hyssop, fantastic. And if you want to grow basil, please get Thai basil. The taste of Thai basil or cinnamon basil is amazing. If you like basil and you like a little bit of anise or licorice taste, you'll love that stuff.
Thanks, Jen. I don't want to offend any licorice lovers, but I can't stand black licorice. It's another thing. It's like cilantro. You either love it or you hate it. And so put me down in the hate category on the licorice. So I don't see any other hands up. So I am going to go ahead with ground cover. But instead of just rambling on and on and on and on, like we did with pH and everything else, I posted a list in the nest, which you all have access to, it's pretty extensive, and it goes from ajuga all the way down to waldestenia, and under that it says low growing junipers, wave petunias, mints, orange, chocolate, peppermint. Obviously, we've covered why mint is not a great ground cover unless you want it to consume your life. But we've got a pretty extensive list here. So I can just kind of, go down the list real quick. And then, if anybody has questions or comments or, oh, I love that, I got that in my house, we can do all that. That's fine. But some considerations when you're trying to decide what ground cover is best for you. The first is you got to know what zone you're in. I'm in zone 5A. I was in 6A. So now something that's considered zone 6 will die at my house. So knowing what zone you're in is important. That's something you can just go to USDA hardiness zone map on Google, and it'll bring up a color-coded map. What's funny is I can dox myself a little bit and tell you, if you look at Massachusetts, there's a little dark blue stain right at the top of northern Massachusetts, which is zone 5A, and everything around that is zone 5B. Well, guess who got the lucky spot? I'm in 5A. There's also further out in the Berkshires, there's 5A too. So now you know where to find me if you ever want to mow my mint-laden lawn a couple of years from now. So knowing your zone is important. The next is sun or shade. And that might not be easy to answer because you might, if you have a kind of a short tree out there, maybe it loses its leaves. It's got sun in the winter, but, during the growing season, that's what when you're asking the question of sun or shade, you're talking about spring and summer for the most part. How much sun do you have? If you get morning sun, but then it gets shaded, then that would be considered part sun or part shade. If if there's light, but there's no direct light, it's like filtered light. So it's not like total darkness, but there's no sun actually hitting that spot. That would be shade, obviously. And then if for at least 6 hours or more, afternoon sun is beating down on that spot, that would be a sunny exposure. So that's another thing to consider. Is it under a tree? Are you looking for a ground cover that's going between pavers? One really great one is there's like, I don't know, a dozen different kinds of thyme. Red creeping thyme is a gorgeous one. I wouldn't even call it red. It's more of a reddish purple when it flowers, but that'll stay really short, and that you can put in between pavers. If you have like, blue stone pavers or slate pavers, you can put that down. There's other small leaf varieties. And some of these, they've actually tried to market as, I don't even know if I can use the name, but they would market them as steppables, where certain varieties of these, low ground covers, you can actually walk on them. So it's things like the thyme, it's things like isotoma, and some other things. Whereas sempervivum, which is hens and chicks, that's the thing that kind of looks like a little echeveria succulent or an agave to a certain extent, I guess, that gets the little babies all around it. That's called hens and chicks or sempervivum. That is not one you can step on. So placement is important. But, is it going on a hillside? Is it going around under a tree?
Yes.
Webmeister.
Yes.
Yes.
It's on a hill and it's under a tree, but will it be toxic to my dog?
I don't think any of the things on here would concern me, other than you've outed yourself. I talked to you, and it was you that had the issues with the ivy. So you don't want the ivy. So that one is not a good one for you. But I think you and I kind of narrowed down your best approach. It doesn't involve a lot of plant material at this time, but I do hope you get to that point. I could see some nice phlox or vinca growing down, unless vinca is the same problem with the snakes. But I'm just going to rattle these off. Feel free to click on that post in the nest so you've got the same list in front of you. If you don't know how to save them to your phone or your computer and you want to write these down, that's fine too. I'm just going to try to speed read through it so we can have a little bit more conversation if anybody has questions or comments, and then we're going to wrap it up. Looks like we're not going to go the full 2 hours this time. That's fine too. So just a few varieties. Ajuga, again, I know Jen says don't do that unless you want it there permanently. Depending upon variety, it's anywhere from zone 3 to 9 or 4 to 11. It varies. And those will take part sun or shade. I've seen them growing in full sun without an issue, especially the larger leaf, more bronze variety with the blue flowers that will take the full sun. Euonymus fortunae, and there's other euonymuses, zone 3 to 9 or 5 to 8, and that one is typically part sun or shade. Again, I've seen some prostrate growing euonymuses grow in some pretty heavy sun too. So when I talk about sun or shade, it's just what is optimal or considered optimal. I've seen hosta, which everybody considers hosta to be, and that's not a great ground cover unless you want your ground cover to be 8 inches tall and send up 3-foot flowers. I bring up hosta because that's one where everybody will say, oh no, hosta is a shade plant. Depending upon the variety and the variegation, I've seen hosta growing in full sun. So just take everything that is discussed in each episode as kind of guidelines, but it doesn't mean you can't try breaking the rules a little bit. Try to plant your euonymus in some afternoon sun. Might be okay, depending upon where you live. Fragaria, we went over that one a little bit earlier. That's actually the genus for strawberry. Fragaria that you'll find kind of like in 1 or 2 gallon pots with kind of the big, hot pink or red flowers. That I actually hold the phone. I have 2 things. I have the same list you're looking at, and then I got a cheat sheet that's got all the Latin names and all of that good stuff. So it's Fragaria vesca, woodland strawberry, generally non-fruiting plant for the shaded border, nice rounded clumps. So they will flower, but you won't necessarily get strawberries on them. If you do, they are edible. Another one is alpine strawberry. Those are more of a trailing wild strawberry. You get little tiny strawberries on them. Gallium or sweet woodruff, zone 4 to 8, part sun or shade. Gaultheria, that is actually wintergreen. You can find a type of Gaultheria out in the woods here in New England, where if you break the leaves, it smells like wintergreen gum. And you can get that commercially at garden centers now. Usually around the fall or Christmas, you'll see it more, where it's a little bushy plant with kind of matte hot pink berries to it. And as long as it hasn't been treated with anything, that there is some edible qualities to that, probably for teas. Heterohelix, that's your common ivy. You might have Baltic ivy, or Thorndale is another variety. That's pretty resilient. It'll take it down to zone 3 and as warm as zone 10, and that'll do sun or shade. But as Jen mentioned, that will take over and it will be difficult to get rid of. Hernaria, zone 5 to 8, sun or part sun. I'm not going to expound on that one because that is one I am not personally familiar with. Isotoma, zone 6 to 9. So that's one that would probably die in a very cold winter here where I live now. That's part sun or shade. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Yep, that is part sun or shade. Isotoma gets little tiny white or baby blue star flowers, similar in texture to the thyme, but the contrast of those light colored flowers on the dark green foliage is a little bit different than, the red thyme. Lamiastrum, zone 4 to 9, part sun or shade, which brings me to the next one, lamium. There's different varieties, zone 3 to 9, 2 to 9, or 4 to 8, part sun or shade. Lamiastrum looks a lot like lamium, but it's a little more woody and stemmed, and it has a much more a thicker leaf to it. Almost looks painted, as if it's green with white paint marks on it, versus your lamiums will tend to be either bicolor or they'll be almost completely silver or gray and softer than the lamiastrum. Those are another one. If you have a shady spot, I don't consider them that invasive, although they are creeping, so they probably could take over an area if given enough time. But lamiums are a good one if you want bright white flowers or pink flowers or purple flowers fairly early to mid-spring, as far as possibly even into early summer, but it'll take heavy amounts of shade. Phlox will take some shade or some sun. The lamiums are going to do better in more shade, but between the foliage and the flowers, that one definitely gets a thumbs up from me on those. Liriope, zone 5 to 10, 4 to 8, or 6 to 10, all depends on variety, and those are part sun or shade. And if you're not familiar with Liriope, it's also called lily turf. Some varieties that are called mondo grass, but it's very popular down south. It actually looks like grass, but it's got long strappy leaves, a much thicker texture to the leaf than a regular grass, but it looks like a clump of grass, only you get spikes of flowers that grow out of the center of it. We do have varieties that will do okay up here, so sometimes you'll see that around trees, but that is a good one, especially, the variety that is, zone 6 to 10. Anytime you see a 9 or a 10 for the zone, that means it'll take it pretty hot. So you folks that live a little further south, definitely, if you hear me say something where it only goes up to like zone 8, be careful. Look up your zone, because I believe northern Florida is a 9. I think above that might be an 8, and then 10 is, I'm pretty sure 10 is like Miami. But always consult the map to be sure. Mazes, zone 5 to 8, part sun or shade. That gets a light blue flower, very floriferous. That means they get a lot of flowers, so that's a good one. Pachysandra, that's popular up here in New England. I don't know about elsewhere, but a very waxy leaf, palmate. It's got looks like a little green hand with 5 long leaves to it, a little bit serrated, kind of plasticky looking. There's a variety called green sheen that is a little less hardy. But that one, I mean, that literally looks like somebody sprayed it with silicone. That'll take part shade or full shade, and that will creep under the ground. It'll send out stolons. So that over time can fill in an area nicely. Phlox subulata, creeping phlox, we talked about, zone 2 to 8. So I don't know where zone 2 is, but I'm thinking like northern New Hampshire or somewhere in Canada, all the way down to zone 8. So you southern folks could enjoy your phlox as well. Sagina, that's Irish moss. that is not a very quick grower. So your Irish moss is going to be good for something like around cobblestones or pavers, something small. It will get a little white flower to it. Um, but it for the most part just like looks like a little fuzzy clump of moss. That's Sagina, zone 4 to 7, part sun or shade. So you don't want to put that in the full sun. That one might get toasted. We did mention sedum. Um, there are sedums that are very hardy, will grow, this far north and farther north. Then there's some species, Angelina, the Rupestre Angelina and the Reflexum blue spruce. Those are two varieties that I mentioned that kind of have the needle type foliage. Those are not as hardy. Angelina, I think, will survive here in Massachusetts. Blue spruce, I wouldn't trust it. So definitely consider sedum for where you are, but if you're somewhere north like me, check the tag, make sure that particular variety is going to be okay in our zone. Sempervivum, we talked about. Wow, that is zone 1 to zone 9. So that'll go pretty far south and pretty far north. I'm going to have to look at the map and see where zone 1 and 2 are, because zone 1 has to be way up there. That one wants full sun. They will spread over time, but it's a slow grower. Usually they'll send out little babies. That's why it's called hens and chicks. So if you're familiar with the succulent called Echeveria, that's got a kind of a rosette type growth to it, they kind of look like that with more of pointed leaves. And they send out the new young babies, which can be removed, propagated via division. Those babies will come out and it'll look like mama plant with all the baby plants. So pretty sure that's how it got its common name, hens and chicks. That's a great one for window boxes. So when we talked about gutter gardening, if you didn't want to do the lettuce or the herbs in the gutter and you wanted to go with something more permanent, doing something with some of these smaller type of ground covers and perennials like hens and chicks or isotoma or some of the thymes. The thyme I'd be a little more concerned about taking over if you have other plants in there, but the hens and chicks, you could put 5 different varieties and just make a window box. It'll look like a succulent window box, and they do flower. They will send up very similar. If you've ever seen an Echeveria in flower, it'll come up and kind of hook like a candy cane, and you'll get little flowers on the end of that. And then the birds will love it because they leave little round seed pods at the end there. Thyme. We mentioned thyme extensively tonight. Thymus is the genus. There's multiple varieties, and their zones range anywhere from 3 to 8, 4 to 9, or 5 to 9. And all the thymes that I would consider love the sun. So I would not choose those for a lower light area. Veronica, we talked about Lewinensis, not Monica Lewinsky, Webmeister. That's zone 3 to 9, and those love the sun. Nice bright blue flower. Vinca minor. And in talking to somebody this week, I wanted to make sure that I clarified there is an annual out there that everybody calls Vinca. Even people in the industry call it Vinca, but it's not Vinca. Annual Vinca is Catharanthus roseus, and it will get oval-shaped, glossy leaves and flat-looking flowers, almost like impatiens, but a little smaller than that. You can find upright ones. You can find trailing ones. They love the heat. That's annual Vinca. Perennial Vinca is can be either green and white variegated or green, and it's more of a creeping trailing plant. They do make Vinca minor alba, which has white flowers. It's a slower grower. I don't think it's as tough as Vinca minor bowls, Bowles. That's a common one up here. Bright blue flowers. I want to say like May through July, but your results may vary. But that's perennial Vinca minor. And when you see the flowering one on the annual bench at Home Depot or the garden center, because we love garden centers too, that's Catharanthus roseus. So everybody's going to call it Vinca, but that's not the Vinca that you want to use as a ground cover or consider as a perennial. And we are almost done. Hang in there. Viola labradorica, or Labrador violet. That's another tough one. Zone 2 to 8, part sun or shade. Waldistinia, I think it's an absolutely hideous plant. It kind of looks like a strawberry, only very viney, like poison ivy. And it's actually, I'm going to look it up because I think it actually doesn't even have a very complimentary name, common name. And I want to insult this one all the way so that you don't grow it. Barren strawberry. So I'm just being silly. You might like it. Occasionally it will get yellow flowers. The leaf is similar to a strawberry, and it will kind of grow and do its thing. I think it's not a very attractive plant. That's just my opinion. But it is a ground cover, and it will take shade, part shade, or sun. So it is versatile. So I have to mention it. That's my job. And as I mentioned, when we first started this little ground cover endeavor, you can consider things like low-growing junipers, wave petunias, and of course we mentioned the mints. But pretty much anything that will take over an area in a fairly short period of time can be considered a ground cover, whether it's a shrub or an annual or a perennial. I recommend perennials only because you plant it once and it just gets, hopefully, if everything works the way it's supposed to, they just get better every year. But sometimes perennials don't give you the flower power you're looking for. So if you've got a hill that gets a lot of sun and you want it to be bright and beautiful with lots of flowers all summer long, that's when you might decide to go with a wave petunia. But that's an annual. So just consider there's going to be a lot of growth and you're going to be like, wow, that filled in the whole area. And then the winter's going to come. And I think even down south, I don't even think you can cut back a petunia. I don't know. I don't live down there, but it's going to die. And you're going to be like, wow, all that growth and all that beauty. And now I have to rip those up and do it all again. So that's all I have. And we do have some hands. So in keeping with tradition in our Punchbowl spaces, we're going to go ladies first and go to question it, and then over to New York Steve.
Sorry, New York Steve. I was going to ask two things. One, with the ground cover, should you not then put the yard fabric down or just avoid it? Because if the point is to have it grow out and spread, how well will it do with the ground cover? And then two, I really want black mondo grass, and I have found it is much cheaper to purchase the plugs than the plant itself, but it recommends that you grow it bigger first and then plant it. Is that, what's your thoughts on that?
Okay, so whether or not you put down the black cloth first is going to depend on the type of ground cover. If it's something that grows underground, like Pachysandra will send out stems under the surface, and then you'll have new Pachysandra tips pop up. You're not going to want to necessarily have that trapped under the fabric. Anything that will typically just grow on the surface and spread that way, even if it tends to root into the surface, once it covers that fabric, the fabric should be staying moist enough that eventually it'll stick to that fabric. It'll find its way in, and the roots will penetrate, and it'll be fine. And what that'll do is, I'm a big proponent of fabric. If you've got that in the budget, and you got the time to put it down, I'm a big proponent of that. That will keep weeds and grass and other stuff from, popping up through. So it all depends on what specifically you choose. And if you look into the plant and find out, oh yeah, well, this spreads from underground stolons, then yeah, don't use the fabric. So like with Pachysandra, you would just kind of put that, maybe even put a little light mulch in between if you didn't want to, because it would take you a lot of Pachysandra to fill in an area. But if you put a light mulch around each plant, that would give it time for those other, plant tips to pop up. I wouldn't put the fabric, but anything that's just growing on the surface, the Veronica Georgia Blue, the sedums, the thyme, yes, I would use the fabric. In terms of the Mondo grass, I don't have firsthand experience on that. Why I'm thinking they're telling you to plant the plugs in a pot and grow it out and then plant it is probably just more for the nurturing aspect of it. Like if you take little tomato plugs and you put those in a big 30-gallon pot, it's going to be very tricky to make sure that soil is not too wet or too dry, because those plants are not doing a whole lot. It's going to take time. So this is how I'm envisioning it. For the same reason that you wouldn't put a tiny, let's call it a 512, that means it comes out of a cell tray that has 512 squares. Just to give you an idea, that the root ball on a 512 plug is probably like a 1/2 inch by a 1/2 inch square. They're tiny. You would want to take that and put that in like a 4-inch pot or a 6-inch pot and have that fill out, so that when it went into a bigger pot or the ground, it's not getting lost by everything around it. So I'm thinking those are maybe a little bit more tender. And so you want to have a nice healthy root system, and have a plant that's big enough that it's not going to get overcrowded. It's not going to be drowned in whatever soil it's going in. It's got a plant that is now, because it's been grown in a larger pot, it's now got a healthier root system, a bigger canopy. You put that in, that can establish itself without, getting lost like a little ant crawling between the blades of grass. That's the only reason I can think that's why they do it that way. And New York, Steve, what you got?
A couple things. First of all, 5A in the house. So I'm with you there, Kevin. Few things. Hospice, great deer food if you want to attract deer. So keep that in mind. That being said, I have a slope that I want to. It's a new slope that I'm creating. Rejiggered my property. I want to have some erosion control and some cover on that. One thing I was thinking of hydro seeding. I don't care how it looks per se. I just want that erosion control and just wanted your input on that.
So if you're going to do hydro seeding, so you're looking, you want to just do grass on the side there.
Well, I was not necessarily I want to do grass. I was going to bring hydro seeding in to do other areas that I'm going to, just hydro seed. And I was thinking on the slope side to help with the erosion control, to have them spray that area to help with that.
So that's a tough one. You could do that at least temporarily to, prevent the erosion so that something is there quickly. My thought is now you got grass there. You can just let it grow tall and blow over in the breeze, or now you got a slope that needs to be mowed. So I mean, I've seen grass on slopes before, so it's really just trying to get the right grass and the right look. And if you're not as concerned with it looking like unmowed grass, or you have the ability or the desire to try to mow it on a slope, I wouldn't steer you away from that. Other options, depending upon the sun exposure, would be just putting a mulch of some sort on that, depending upon the grade of the hill. You might get some of it washing down. Sounds like your slope is similar to Webmeister's slope, although he's doesn't have a lot of sun. I don't know your sun exposure, but that's what we were bouncing around the other day, was maybe some mulch, and then at some point peeling back the mulch and popping in a few gallon vinca or junipers or something, so that those could creep down the hill. He's never got to mow it again.
Don't care about mowing it. Don't care how it looks. I just want it to stay put and not move. So if that means I have tall grass or hit the grass, twice a season with a weed whacker, so be it.
Yeah, I mean, if it's not something that you want to be showy per se, and you're not, concerned about, keeping it neat and trim, then yeah, go for it. I would, perennial ryegrass, some type of fescue. I think, up here, like a double eagle blend, you could probably get at a hardware store or something that's got the perennial rye in it. That would probably be sufficient just for erosion control.
Great, thanks. Stay away from the hostas if you have deer.
I have hosta here, and that's the one thing that I lucked out. They didn't touch the hosta, although they waited until I took the broccoli out of the fenced-in area because I needed more room in there, and thought, oh, these plants are big, haven't seen any animals, put those out there, and then they looked like pathetic little twigs. And somebody said, oh yeah, that's deer like broccoli. So they skipped my hosta, but they went after the broccoli. Go ahead, Jen.
Don't say that about Webmeister.
So for ground covers, I don't know if you mentioned blue-eyed grass. It's a native grass. I absolutely love it. And it doesn't spread very much, like very easily itself, but it grows in clumps and you can spread it yourself by separating the clumps. It literally only takes a little bit to grow a whole nother plant. Also, geranium. I have cranesbill geranium, two different kinds, and that does a great job with ground cover. Both of those enjoy sun. One that will definitely take off, and it's yellow, bright yellow almost, is Creeping Jenny But again, you still have the problem of removing that if you don't want it there because it does take over. Um, Also, I don't know if anybody's starting a new garden or a vegetable garden or things like that, but I did find that going to the local landscaping yard, they have a discard brick pile that they normally have there, and they have no problem with me going through and picking stuff out. And I have gotten landscaping bricks, edging, I've gotten some beautiful flagstone, all that kind of stuff. So if you live close to any kind of landscaping yard that takes in debris and sells stuff, they might have that kind of a pile for you to go pick at, and it saves you a whole bunch of money. I do not. I am not a proponent anymore of landscaping fabric. If you have the time to get rid of all your lawn and all the stuff that's in the ground, get rid of it first, because pulling up that landscaping fabric after it starts finally poking up because every all the roots and everything is growing healthy underneath it is a pain in the butt. You got to cut it around the existing plants and hope that you don't damage them and everything else. I love mulch, and I love hardwood mulch because it actually kind of helps and benefits the soil itself, and hopefully eventually you can grow some mushrooms there. So that's all I got to say about that.
Thanks, Jen. And yes, thanks for bringing up perennial geranium. One really nice variety is Roxanne. And that's another one of those things where the horticultural industry has confused a lot of people, because you get those red flowering things at Memorial Day to planted gravesides, and everyone says that's a geranium. Well, yes, that's the common name for that, but your geraniums and the hanging baskets and the 4-inch plants that you plant for color during the summer, and scented geraniums, both of those are actually not geraniums. They are pelargoniums. Pelargoniums. Real geraniums are perennials. So it's kind of like the vinca thing. Geraniums have been mislabeled even by professionals for decades, and it's just what they do. You mentioned creeping Jenny, Lismachia. Be aware that in Massachusetts and I believe New Hampshire and some other locations, it is considered invasive. It is a very beautiful plant. It's got like chartreuse, almost neon, yellowy green foliage. And I got some from some sources, and I don't care if it, takes over my whole yard, because it is pretty and it actually does get a pretty flower. It's not illegal to own it. You just cannot commercially sell it in some states because it is considered invasive. So just keep that in mind. If you run across quote unquote creeping Jenny, there are other types of Lismachia that are not quite as invasive. So it's really the creeping Jenny variety. I believe it's Lismachia nummularia or something to that effect, with little round chartreuse, yellowy green leaves. That's the one. There's a variegated variety that's less invasive, and I think that's still allowed by the government. So I'll just leave it at that. So, any other questions or comments before we wrap this up?
Perhaps just one more. Steph came up on stage, but she didn't raise her hand. Did you have a question or a comment, Steph? Well, it doesn't look like we have any more hands, Kevin. Go ahead.
Okay, so this is that fun part of the evening, and look at that, 9:29. So we did go for the 2 hours. It's a good thing that I planned accordingly. So at this time, I want to thank you all for joining me. We've got so much that we can cover from, I think I haven't fully decided what our next one's going to be, but I'm trying to keep it seasonally appropriate. So we'll get into some of the veggies that take it cool. We'll get into seeding and, is it better to direct seed or seed in packs first? All depends on the type of veggie, in my opinion. Again, these are my opinions, my experiences. Your results may be different. If it's not broken, don't fix it. If you're having great results and we talk about something, by all means, try it out. But if you're having good luck otherwise, then don't stray too far off the path and go the wrong way. And I don't want to keep going any further until we hear from Mr. Yellow Bastard.
I missed most of the first session last week. I caught most of this one. So forgive me if I'm asking a stupid question. Have you gone over planting schedule for spring, summer, and fall? Like for vegetable gardens?
Not exactly. So that is something we can cover, because depending upon the vegetables that are being planted, you can stagger them so that you have overlapping crops. If that's what you mean, we haven't really gotten into that. I did do a little bit tonight about layout and trying to plant things in a way that they're not overshadowing each other, but not really much in terms of the scheduling. So who knows? Maybe that will be next week.
Thanks.
Thank you. For those that may have joined late and did not hear, the IT wizards at the Punchbowl have been working on a website. So you can now go to www.thepunchbowl.
Sorry, Kev. There's no www. It's the Punchbowl .space. That's the whole address. The Punchbowl .space. Go ahead.
So I guess on the internet, you don't use the W's anymore. That's fine. Shows what I know. And that's why.
And there's no .com on the end. It's just the Punchbowl .space.
Correct. So the Punchbowl.space, we have a website now. So you can go there and you can see any scheduled space, even Bishop's space for tomorrow, the town square, where he usually has Psychic Brian and Jeff as the co-host, 7:30 a.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern every morning. That he's already scheduled for tomorrow, so that shows up. The one I have tonight probably still shows up as live because we're still live. And every time we add a space, it will go there. You can also find everybody on the Punchbowl team. When I say Punchbowl team, I'm talking about, the core 9 that run the day to day. And we also have Punchbowl family. We have, extended, co-hosts and friends of the Punchbowl. And then, of course, our loyal listeners and audience that come in. So the Punchbowl is big, but if you follow the 9 Punchbowl team members on that site, you'll never miss a space or what's going on. We have our music space on Saturday nights, usually starting around 9 with DJ Java and Psychic Brian. Arlinda Java also comes back on Sunday nights, usually around 7 for the Punchbowl Bible Society. And then I will keep holding these spaces either Monday nights or Tuesday nights, depending upon my schedule, typically around 7:30 p.m. And all attempts to make this a 1-hour space have failed. So plan on 2 hours, but don't worry if you can't make it, or you can't stay for the full 2 hours. These are going to be recorded. And this is important. My co-host, Martin, has done an amazing job, and I'm trusting he will do an amazing job again, turning these Twitter space recordings into a cleaner, more edited podcast. and those will be posted as soon as they're available. As we post those, as we come up upon each episode, I'm going to delete the previous week's episode. So everybody's got 1 week to share the original, to read the comments, all that stuff. But as we come up to that next episode, that Twitter recording is going to go away. And on this thread for the Punchbowl Garden and Home, you're going to be able to go down and see each episode, the photos of what was discussed, and I'll insert these podcasts in there. To me, it's a much cleaner recording. So if there's any dead air at the beginning, or if Martin wants to edit out my WWWs, he can do that. So it's a nicer sounding podcast. So I've decided so like for this week, I'll keep this recording up until our next episode, either Monday or Tuesday. And then probably that following morning, this one will get deleted, assuming Martin's had time to get that podcast going. He can even edit out this entire little speech at the end I'm giving. That's how good he is. So thank you, Martin, for all of your help tonight. I see I've got a broccoli requesting, and he is a core member of the Punchbowl team. So I am not gonna leave until we find out if Mr. Webmeister has a question.
Oh, I had my 11-year-old FaceTime me, and I missed the last 15 minutes. Can you repeat it all?
We were just explaining where you can find the recording.
I know, I was kidding.
This is a family show. If it wasn't, anyways. So that's right. I said anyways.
He covered all the varieties of broccoli
in
the world.
For those, I'm looking at the room so it's safe. For those who don't know, during the day, we have some folks who use the word anyways a lot. And whenever they say that on the back channel, we're like, drink.
Drink. Drink.
Okay. I can see this devolving quickly. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. I'm going to thank you all for joining me. Anytime you have questions, I forgot, what about such and such? Don't be afraid to leave a comment on this space, or if you're following me, I'll try to follow you back. If I'm not following you back, leave a comment on one of these spaces. Say, hey, what's the deal, buddy? I'm following you. I got questions. I can't DM you. Follow me back. And I will try to do so that we can make contact during the week.
Hey, Kevin.
Yes, sir.
So I'm working on this big 57-acre estate on Long Island. About 50 of the acres are wooded, untouched. That's about 6 acres in the interior of the property were cultivated and landscaped very nicely over the last 90 years when the house was first built in 1929. However, over the last 45 years, there really wasn't much done except just sort of maintenance, right? And we've got fruit, we have trees, we have apple trees, we have fruit, pear trees. Everything is covered. Everything was covered in Pachysandra, the beds in around the different buildings on the property. We've actually been removing acres of Pachysandra. You can't even imagine. And what we're uncovering now is a lot of old flowering plants that were planted by the original owners, possibly, that were daffodils, and it's all starting to pop up now that the Pachysandra's been cleared. It's kind of interesting. And the caretaker's been there for 17, 18 years, and he's like, I've never seen any of these flowers before, because everything was covered in Pachysandra.
So that is just a good point, that Pachysandra is one of those ground covers that will, I wouldn't say as bad as mint, but I suppose if it's been a few years, it could be. Make wise choices. Decide ahead of time, what you think you want to see in that spot for the next 5 to 10 years, because it may, as Yellow pointed out on Pachysandra and some of the other items we've talked about tonight, you could end up taking several days to try to undo what you've done. But if you love Pachysandra and you want it to grow there forever, I guess that's a sparkling endorsement for the resiliency of Pachysandra. But with that, I am going to wrap this up and thank you all once again. Don't forget to go to the punchbowl.space to look at all the scheduled upcoming spaces. And you all have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you.